Biblical Hebrew is a dead language. That's apparently a spicy take that I used to think was uncontroversial until I started reading internet comments. But it's what's called a hook, and it's supposed to either get you interested or hopping mad so that you hate watch to the end of the video. Let's talk about why you should learn it. Hello everyone, this is Gilgamesh. This is a channel where we look at the Hebrew Bible from a literary and academic viewpoint and try to appreciate its beauty. Dr. Taylor Jones of the channel Language Jones did a video recently about 6 tips for language acquisition that I really liked. The tips he provides are about spaced repetition and other techniques that I wholeheartedly endorse for any language learner, not that he needs my endorsement. And he also went into some detail recently on Hebrew and the relationship between modern and ancient Hebrew. And yes, he also explains biblical is a dead language. This does not mean it was an unknown language or that it did not continue to hold a significant place in ritual and scholarly circles. Much like Latin, it continued to present day long after any community had ceased using it as their primary communication system, which is pretty much the definition of what a dead language is. But if you don't like that term, let's just pretend I said historical language then. But none of that is very important what we're talking about today, which is how learning the language of the dead is different from learning the language of the living. We can all agree that the authors of the biblical text lived long ago, and along with everyone from their communities, are quite dead, right? That's enough agreement for our purposes today. We also apparently need to agree a little bit on how time works. See, the words we use today and the meaning we give them depends on a common understanding of these words by the people alive today. What the words we use today will come to mean in a few centuries from now is not relevant to what the words mean today, and does not provide any greater insight into what the words mean now. This means that when you are working with texts of those who have long slept in the dust, the same principles apply. It is important that you only look at linguistic information that can reasonably be tied to their time and place. Offering what future people understand words to mean is not helpful and often counterproductive. Sometimes it takes careful investigation to separate early meanings of words from later meanings. We should be clear-eyed about what we mean when we talk about learning the Hebrew of the Bible. We are talking about the Hebrew that was spoken and used from maybe about the 12th century to the 3rd century BCE. This is very important as we evaluate resources we use to understand this language. When Hebrew began is unclear, and when it ended as a primary spoken language is also a little bit fuzzy, but for our purposes, suffice it to say, it is clear by the end of the 2nd or 3rd century BCE that the texts that we are interested in had reached something very close to their final form. The Hebrew used by rabbis in composing famous texts like the Mishnah was of a very different nature. Modern Hebrew is a unique and fascinating story of its own, and I'm not going to worry about it today. We are speaking of the Hebrew of Tanakh. So what makes studying a dead language different? Dr. Jones in his video did touch on a few items briefly, but I think there is much more to say about it. Most people who have studied languages have done so with living languages, where the primary goal is speaking. It is common to begin studies learning to say, "I have a red pencil." "Where is the hotel?" "I would like 2 beers, please." And "when those sirens go off, should I head to the bomb shelter?" These are important in modern context. None of this makes much sense when you step back in time 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. So you won't run into anything like this studying a dead language. Instead, It's much more important to know how to say, "Cursed art thou above all the cattle of the earth," or "Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the grain." Useful stuff. With a dead language, you're always reading, because anyone who could speak the language of this time is dead. You can never speak a dead language because either you are simply vocalizing what the dead left us in writing, or you are creating a new modern composition that we have no way of knowing if it would have sounded correct to those who lived then. And they have no way of hearing it. Yes, this does mean that reading is the one form of necromancy that actually works. Isaiah talks about it in Isaiah 29. It says, "They would speak low out of the dust. Their voice would be like one who has a familiar spirit out of the ground. They would whisper from the dust." This is the miracle of writing. Isaiah sees it as a scroll that is sealed. It can cross time and space to allow those who lived halfway around the world thousands of years ago to speak directly to us. It only works in a single direction, but that is amazing technology all the same. Now, some things to note about studying a dead language. First item, conversations are entirely one-sided. There is no need to talk back or struggle with rapidly composing a reply. The other person is dead. Pronunciation is unimportant. No one's completely sure the exact pronunciation in use at the time of the textual composition, and there are competing ideas of how to properly pronounce things.
Knowledge.
Pronunciation systems are generally to please modern listeners, so you may choose to follow the system preferred by your synagogue or your professor, but this has no real bearing on the language. In reality, there existed numerous dialects and accents over the many centuries and areas that the language was in use. None of the modern pronunciations match that of the biblical authors, and the Dead Sea MP3s didn't survive to give us a good idea of how they spoke. We know from stories in the text that different groups had different speech patterns. For example, Ephraimites having trouble making a proper sh sound in the word shibboleth in Judges 12. The only people actually qualified to correct your pronunciation are dead. Reading aloud is a performative art that is to be admired in its own right, but it is entirely separate from comprehension. That said, as humans, we do learn better with multisensory inputs, and learning to hear words in whatever pronunciation system you prefer can help learn the language. Also, people who are well-trained and able to read the text in a performative setting, whether this is an audiobook or in a synagogue, can be very pleasant to listen to and are to be admired. But do not confuse such performative talents with language comprehension. And don't let anyone tell you that only their pronunciation system is valid. And certainly don't let anyone tell you that only a particular ethnic group or religious sect can understand the language. The text itself is clear on this point. This was a spoken language by prophets and pagans, righteous and sinners, even the Assyrians at the gate of Jerusalem. It is a dialect largely indistinguishable from that of the Canaanite and Moabite cultures. Today, there are great scholars of many faiths and many countries who have advanced training in this language and publish excellent scholarship about it. While we certainly must be grateful to the people who helped guard and preserve the text from ancient times, many of whom we will never know the names of, the text itself is part of the legacy of all mankind, just as some of its authors expressed the hope that it would become such. Isaiah says, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. Many peoples shall go and say, Come ye, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He also says, in that day shall the deaf hear the words of the book, and the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness. I grew up in the Deep South, and you really haven't heard Hebrew until you have experienced it with a strong Southern accent, as was frequently the case in the synagogue I frequented. But while different people may have preferences, there's really nothing less valid about such pronunciations, and no way to know which reader an ancient person would judge to be superior. There are Hebrew students all over the world who use ancient Hebrew with a great variety of accents and inflections, and none of it is relevant to comprehending the language. As mentioned, the conversation is entirely unidirectional. Next item, audible comprehension is unimportant. One of the main challenges of living languages is figuring out what that rapid-fire sentence from the native actually was. This is not an issue because all the speakers are dead. You have the text in front of you, and never will there be a need to recognize from audio the word that is being used. Recognizing it from handwriting on some of the early texts can be its own exciting challenge, but you can also see it in easy-to-read modern fonts and printings. Now, it can be nice to hear and recognize the words, and I do encourage people to listen regularly to people using their favorite pronunciation systems, but the entire message is available to us only as text and can only be approximated as audio from modern readers. Next item, speed is unimportant. It doesn't matter how fast you read or how quickly you can rattle off a sentence. Take your time. The other person will not grow impatient. They're dead. Language learners have often known the frustration of thinking that they have some sort of grasp on a language only to be completely lost as a native speaker hits them with words faster than they thought possible. As a slow reader in every language, I can say with confidence that speed is not comprehension. The text has been there for thousands of years. It isn't going anywhere. Take your time. Enjoy every word. There is no race to get to the end. However, hitting the like and subscribe button is essential. So if you haven't done that, do that now. Next item, word meanings are important. When the text was composed, no one knew what a dictionary was, and texts were composed centuries apart and went through various cycles of editing and language change over time. The result is a confusing mess and the source of many academic papers. Do not look to modern Hebrew for word meanings. Modern Hebrew words are informed from biblical meanings. It doesn't work the other way around. Again, this is how time works. If you know the modern language of modern Hebrew, a big challenge is actually to leave behind assumptions and connotations of the words in modern context and ask what it meant to the people who composed the text. No, you can't ask the author for a definition or to use the word in a different sentence. They're dead. We understand word meaning from three sources. Number one, tradition. Be careful. Not every tradition is correct. Number two, context. Most powerful when a word is used very frequently. The context in which it is used help us get a full sense of its meaning the more often it's used. And number three, comparative contemporary languages. Something we've really only had good access to over about the past century. Yes, that does mean there is much that we have learned about Hebrew in the past century that simply was not available to earlier scholars, and it is quite important to use resources that are reasonably up to date. Next item. Grammar is important. In a living language, grammar is a nicety, but we all know that really, in the beginning, it all comes down to a few words, a lot of hand signs, and body language to get your point across. And you probably still sound like a caveman, but people will smile and encourage you all the same. With a dead language, the text is all you have to work with. So the goal is to wring as much meaning as possible from what we have. This means carefully parsing every word to understand what we can about its intended use. This should not be confused with the idea that the ancients had good grammar. They didn't even have a concept of what grammar was, and spelling was pretty loose too. Grammar is descriptive, not prescriptive. This means it describes what we generally see in how the language works, and it's of no value as a set of rules of how it must work. You will frequently find places that violate our understandings of grammar, but you have no idea if this represents an error or a different dialect or a specific form. You can't scold them for using the wrong verb conjugation. They're dead. And so, for all you know, this is the proper way to say what it was they were trying to say. One of the shocking things is that much knowledge of the language was indeed lost. We only started to work out and record what we believed were the rules of their grammar many centuries later. Our knowledge remains imperfect and will probably always be so, as there was probably never a single uniform standard that all of the authors followed. While the details of grammar can get a bit complicated in some specialized cases, for the most part, the essentials we know of the grammar of the biblical authors can be covered quite nicely in a fairly small book. If you truly hate grammar, it will be a limitation on how much meaning you can get from the text. But if you're only reading for your own enjoyment, many people do accomplish getting to that level with just a minimal understanding of grammar. Next item, the text is limited. With biblical Hebrew, there's the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, my very well-loved copy. There's also the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are either biblical texts themselves or very late Hebrew compositions. There's also a handful of rather short inscriptions. The Siloam inscription and the Lachish letters are probably the most famous. There really is nothing else to read. Yes, you can actually fully master this language with the knowledge of only about 7,000 words and maybe about 1,500 proper names. With only the knowledge of 686 words, you can read 90% of the text. This is according to the Schwartz-Groves Westminster Hebrew Vocabulary, which is an excellent resource. Learn 20 words per week. You'll reach that level in about 9 months. That is ambitious, but doable. The finite nature of a dead language is a major part of its appeal. Modern Hebrew has roughly 10 times the number of vocabulary words in its lexicon and endlessly more text to read, hear, and interact with. While the Bible isn't small, my copy of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia is only 1,574 pages long. Read a page a day, and you'll have worked through the entire text in about 4.5 years. Well, that is plenty to keep you busy and challenge you. It's also a very achievable goal. Next item, the text is unknown. If you want to learn Hebrew, because it would be cool to understand Isaiah or Job, and you have trouble making heads or tails of the translation in some places, you may be disappointed. Yes, there are many, many valuable insights to be gained. It is absolutely worth it to learn the language. However, there are also about 1,500 words in the language that show up only once in the text. And often we don't know much about what they mean, and we rely mostly on context clues and early translations into other languages. similar words from other languages, or tradition. Further, there are places where we know all the words, but put them together, they don't make a great deal of sense. Even more of a problem is the text was hand copied for centuries, and the oldest texts have long since crumbled to dust. And no two hand copied texts are exactly the same. Translators actually tend to hide some of these problems because the resultant translated text tends to read smoothly in the target language. But this is much of the reason why different translations get so different in places. The truth is, there are parts that are simply unreadable to anyone, where the text has been damaged or the meaning has been lost. But don't let that discourage you at all. Trying to puzzle together what the meaning of some of these difficult passages is a major part of the fun. You will encounter all sorts of interesting, conflicting ideas from some very smart people. Well, there is generally no way to settle what the correct reading is. It can be a lot of fun exploring the possibilities. Keep an open mind, and you just might learn things that surprise you. Hopefully, this was a helpful introduction to studying Biblical Hebrew and gives a good idea of what to expect and how it will be different from studying a modern language. If you have struggled with the higher pressures and stress of learning a living language, perhaps the more introspective and pedestrian pace of listening to the dead will be more to your liking. I wish you the best on your journey. Until next time.